Okay, are you ready to begin? So hello and welcome to Geek Chic's Weird Science live at Latitude Festival. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us here today at the Wellcome Trust Arena, and also to all the lovely people listening at home. My name's Leanna Birds. I will be your host today, along with my radio hubby, Dr. Jack Lewis.
Miyuyam Ataham, everybody.
So what language is that hello in, Jack?
There's native Indians in the United States. They live in the area near La Jolla. So it's very specific, the Luiseño Indian.
So you thought you were just here for some weird science, but Jack has, in the 75 episodes of this podcast we've done now, said hello in a different language at the start of each. So if you want to go down and listen to every single podcast ever, at the least, you'll know how to say hello in 75 languages. So I highly recommend you do it. A very warm welcome as well to our incredibly special guests. It's Robin Ince and Helen Keane. So, on each episode of Geek Chic's Weird Science, we delve through the latest research, the latest stories from the weird and wonderful world of science, and we pick our favourites. And our guests have not disappointed this week. We will be, over the next hour, talking about transgender fish, cannibalistic caterpillars, heroin vaccines, decorating spiders, altruistic chimps, and as if that wasn't enough, white chocolate is good for us. Yes! So, let us begin. Dr. Jack, this is a story that came out this week, a report suggesting that 1/5 of all male fish in English rivers are now transgender. And it could all be down to the contraceptive pill. How so, Dr. Jack?
Indeed. So it's always the way, isn't it? You start the slideshow on the last slide and it immediately ends. So please forgive that. I thought this is a rather beautiful picture because I think it sums it up. You all probably remember from The Simpsons. Remember there was a fish that had 3 eyes because it was kind of genetically mutated from all the effluent from the nuclear power stations. Well, it turns out that we produce our own wastes, and when they go through the sewage system, they're leaching out into our waterways, and 20% of the fish in the UK waterways are now intersex or transgender. So it's not just that they like clipping around in heels, wearing ladies' clothes. It goes further than that. There are things like, the sperm motility is not so great in these 20% transgender fish. They are less aggressive than they normally would be in terms of being boisterous and competitive with other male fish, which is very important for male fish to win the attention of the ladyfish, apparently. I'm no expert. So it goes further. The male fish, 20%, they're even laying eggs. So now you know something really fishy is going on, right? No pun intended. And apparently, it's all the ladies' fault. Human ladies' contraceptive pill are being flushed out in the effluent. So you can make water healthier. You can extract a lot of the nasties. But some of these estrogen-based chemicals, there's over 200 types, and they are going out into the waterways and changing the sex of these fish.
Jack, are we flushing them down the loo in our wee, or are we
Correct.
literally flushing them down the loo as pills?
A lot of the articles that covered this did not clarify that, and it's an important thing. Yeah, it's not about throwing them away, it's just normal. They go through your system, you excrete them away, you flush the toilet, and you imagine that it will be dealt with by the Environment Agency. Sadly, because estrogens are very hard to extract from wastewater, they end up back in the rivers. So even more worryingly is that once you get to the 2nd and 3rd generation of transgender fish, they become more and more sensitive to the estrogens in the water. So then it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. It's going to become like a virus that spreads through our waterways. Now, obviously, they're very worried about this. This was the work of Professor Charles Tiley. He's based at Exeter University, and there was a huge 50th anniversary symposium of the Society for Fisheries of the British Isles. This is quite a worrying thing. Now, what can you do? Cross your legs. No, but at the moment, I think we just need to get to the point where we can actually extract all of the nasties that we put into the waterways. At the moment, unfortunately, technology doesn't seem quite up to scratch.
Can I ask, I don't know if either of you all know this, or Helen all knows, but is there something about the kind of solidity or the impermanence of human sex differences, which actually means that something like this is not that bizarre in the natural world, though this might be, because I know there's some form of stacking limpet where basically that you have a stack of limpets in which they are all male, and basically as they go down, as each one dies and moves on, as they get to the when the male gets to the bottom of the pile, it becomes female. So we have, and also in terms of, I suppose this is more again it's kind of sex and gender differences. In sticklebacks, as far as I know, we don't see what might be considered, traditional fish heterosexual behaviour. I think that was Desmond Morris wrote about that. So, does anyone help?
Does anyone help?
I'm just not. Does anyone help out the sticklebacks? But I'm interested in thinking that the change, the sex differences, that we're viewing it as human beings who see it as reasonably solid, specific, male-female sex differences.
Yeah. No, so I think that the difference here is that quite often different species will change their sex. They won't change their sex spontaneously, but from one generation to the next, if there's loads and loads of males, then maybe it'll sort of, the egg will be slightly cooler, and then it'll come
lizards
out more
do
females.
that, don't they? Crocodiles and lizards hatch at different temperatures, and you get female lizards that have XY chromosomes. So then it doesn't correspond. Our chromosomal knowledge doesn't correspond.
That's
with
right.
I think.
And in that case, it's adaptive to that creature. The difference is here, there's nothing adaptive about the changes happening in these fish as a result of the kind of estrogens. And it's not just estrogens from us. There's also estrogens in plastic. When you break down certain plastics, there's estrogen-like compounds, and those have been shown to clog up heart valves, for example. So it's got nothing to do with sort of genitalia. These estrogens. Hormones are incredibly powerful because they can get right into the heart of the cell, if you like, right into the nucleus, and actually change the way the DNA is read off.
But isn't that sort of one of the measures of whether it's a successful, whether it's an adaptation that can be coped with or not, whether they can still breathe? So if the males are laying eggs, then presumably they can carry on breeding. So maybe that's just what's going to happen. We're just going to have lots of transgender fish, and they're still going to reproduce, and that's going to be fine.
It's true. So you're right. It seems like that for the moment, but as they become more and more feminized, it might be that their ability to create sperm. So the male can produce eggs. So he's going to produce the sperm. There's another one. Are you about to?
No, I was actually going to say, is there any suggestion that this can pass up the food chain? Because obviously we eat fish, and other animals eat fish as well. Is this something that could potentially be passed along?
Certainly. I don't know the details of it, but it's definitely out there. It's definitely being researched, and it's definitely got the potential, right? Because these hormones affect all of us. It's human hormones affecting fish. That's probably the surprising thing. If this stuff were to affect humans, surely that wouldn't be so surprising.
And I know what you're about to say, because Jack and I last year turned our podcast into a book called The Mice Who Sing for Sex and Other Weird Tales from the World of Science. And in it, we talked about other human drugs affecting the behavior of creatures, in particular birds, right? And this was to do with antidepressants.
Yes, so this is SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, things like Prozac. When they're being flushed away in waste, they noticed that the worms that were near the sewage treatment plants, and this was work done by the University of York, the starling populations were plummeting. And the reason was that they were eating the worms that was chock full of Prozac, and then because a well-known side effect of Prozac is that it can have a negative effect on your libido, it was having a negative effect on starling libidos. So it's quite startling the things that are happening. And also the antidepressant effect in fish is that, as with all antidepressants, it makes you feel more buoyant, and that mood-enhancing effect means that rather than being shy roach hiding in the little waterways, it makes them more boisterous, more bolshy, and so there's a much greater possibility of them being caught by predators because they're not naturally hiding away in the reeds as much as they used to. So there's also our drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, going through our bodies into the waterways. It's causing havoc, but for the time being, we can still have fish and chips.
Because you mentioned mice that sing, one of the most interesting bits of research I remember, this is from the mid-1970s, when there was a tremendous fear about what rock and pop music would do to your minds. And I know there was a religious organisation that hired some scientists who found out, according to their research, that if you played disco music to mice for long enough, it made them gay. And if you played heavy metal to pigs, it made them deaf.
Amazing.
So that's not
And
so
please,
surprising.
next year, if they book Niles Rogers for Latitude, bring your mice. Let us see the cavalcade of mice. But can I say, it's not, I would say, hard science. It really was this kind of like, we have to find a way that we must ban this music.
There's
Look
also,
at these
Robin,
flamboyant mice.
there's also, apparently, if you play Black Sabbath, it'll make your plants grow faster. True fact. Human beings, though, aren't the only ones who are causing havoc with our chemicals on other creatures. Isn't that right, Robin? Because this week there was word of tomato plants employing some sneaky tactics and affecting the behaviour of caterpillars and possibly even turning them into cannibals.
You've summed up the story.
Moving on.
Cannibalism is something that has always intrigued me. If I remember once when someone would you ever eat like and I'm a vegetarian, but if I had to, I would be fascinated to eat, just a small amount of a human being.
I would not want to be stranded on a desert island with you, Robin.
How many people here have occasionally thought, if push comes to shove and we're trapped in the mountains and it doesn't involve murder, right? Who'd think, I'll give it a go. I would be interested.
Tastes like chicken.
I'm horrified to say that almost all the tent nodded and agreed there.
No, this is because this is a proper curious audience that go, I just want to know, right? And I find, because in fact, I met a guy called Svante Pääbo. I don't know if anyone's aware. Svante Pääbo, an incredible scientist who led the team that basically managed to sequence Neanderthal DNA. And one of the reasons that it's very, very hard, obviously, the older bones are, etc., you get degrading of DNA, you get also contamination of DNA. And it was when they found a collection of bones which appeared to have been basically Neanderthal bones, Neanderthals that had been eaten. And the reason that the DNA was intact or reasonably intact was because they had cut all the meat off. They'd cut every part and all the muscle off to eat it, which meant that predators, etc., hadn't contaminated it. So quite often you have it contaminated by, wolves or whatever. So this, though, is another form of... I probably know too much about cannibalism. Whose favourite cannibal's Sawney Bean? Anyway, whose favourite cannibal movie is the film Deathline? That's the one with the mind the doors bit. It's brilliant. Anyway, so what's happened is that it appears... again, the beauty of mutation, heredity, and natural selection, and at the point where sometimes it almost seems purposeful, but of course it's not purposeful, it's just that the advantage in the same way that an orchid, which looks far more like a female insect, obviously has this tremendous advantage. I recommend Charles Darwin's book about orchids, which remains fascinating. So in this case, it is that these tomato plants, and I've written it down because I wouldn't remember, it's methyl jasmonate. And what this is it makes the leaves taste disgusting to caterpillars. And this is not the only plant that does this, but this is the one that's particularly been discovered in this research. And what happens in moments of, I suppose, caterpillar desperation is because they can't find any leaf sweet, they turn to consuming themselves. And obviously that means that this plant in particular manages to survive well because the caterpillar predators don't eat more of the leaves. So that's why. So if you ever are going, I think this is why a lot of people who go to Nando's turn to cannibalism as well. I've never been to Nando's. I'm presuming it's awful, but mainly because I'm a vegetarian. So look at this, it's all covered in our magic salt, and. So yeah, anything that is... Well, actually, I generally find most food that's served in a bucket can lead to cannibalism.
You'd think they'd have more options, wouldn't you, than just like, either I'm going to eat this tomato plant or I'm going to eat my brother, basically, which seems to be what's going on with the caterpillars. I'm slightly worried about your love of cannibalism. I'm going to be honest, Robin. I'm just wondering when you
express your interest in cannibalism genuinely, it does lower the likelihood of you turning immediately to it.
Okay, more pros. You're making me think of that film, was it Alive, when they eat each other after the play? That's a true film as well. I wonder what human beings taste like. It's got to be chicken, right? Everything tastes like chicken. Okay, so speaking of our little cannibal caterpillars, there are actually some benefits, aren't there, Robin, though? Because if you do eat your own kind, you can actually benefit from getting full proteins and basically everything you need, right? So it could be something that's actually beneficial to these caterpillars.
Are we advocating cannibalism?
Well, yeah, I mean, we seem to be going down that trend. We might as well run with it.
Except when it's interesting, because I don't know about this at the caterpillar level, and I don't know how much that affects then the butterfly. That, kind of like you might end up, they become more of a kind of, looking like a death's head moth rather than a butterfly. There might be some sense of eventual evolutionary warning. But, on a mammalian scale, and again, I'm guessing at this, but certainly from what we saw when cows are basically fed other cows, and you heard there in the background just some children going, so sad about the cows. But it's and at the same way also from what we can see with some of the cannibal populations, human cannibal populations, again, this does not seem to be advantageous for, in particular, I think, brain proteins.
Okay.
But you probably know more than me.
Okay, interesting. And you know what? These caterpillars, they're not the only little critters that have made the news this week. And we're talking about, survival and all that. There was a really interesting story about tardigrades.
The tardigrade or water bear. Who here have you seen images of the tardigrade? And they are so. It's like when you see them, you don't imagine, because you imagine them much bigger when you show them to someone the first time. And they're called water bears. That's their nickname for them, and they look rather beautiful and cuddly, but they're actually normally a little bit below a millimetre. And the cockroach, of course, has always been the creature that we're told that will be the one that survives Armageddon. In fact, we don't really have.
Oh, here we go.
Evidence.
We have a photo.
Oh, there we go. The tardigrade. Show
Thank you, lovely lady in the audience who brought her paper along.
And
there we go. This is the tardigrade. It looks kind of slightly like he has an anus for a mouth, unfortunately, but other than that, rather cute. There we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, there's the. Maybe you should just come and read the story. It will save me a lot of time if you've got it there. It's, but it is. It appears because actually cockroaches we don't know. This is. I was talking to a guy who's kind of looked into that, and the test you have to do to find out if a cockroach will survive a nuclear war have enormous ramifications, and really aren't worth the health and safety guidelines that must be broken. But the tardigrade seems to have an ability. Not only can it, for instance, survive in the vacuum of space, it can survive at also absolute zero. There is a belief that if we had an asteroid strike that was so cataclysmic that it would actually boil off the oceans, the tardigrade would be able to survive. Though it survives in a kind of dried form, which in some ways means that at that point it's not alive, but it does still have. It can, should liquid return. With luck, it can revivify as well.
Yeah, that's happened in museums, hasn't it? Where they found them on old pieces of moss, and these pieces of moss have been gathered like 100 years ago, and then someone splashed some water on the moss deliberately or otherwise, and the tardigrades have kind of woken up after like 100 years, which is pretty extraordinary.
They
would. Love that. That's what's the frog? There's a frog which in the winter hibernates and has no trace of life, for something of that scale, has no trace of life. And again, we look at it from a human scale, and that seems preposterous. And yet, within the animal kingdom, here we have a creature which, if you picked it up, if you looked for any life signs, there are none whatsoever.
But it would die, of course, when the sun ceased to exist. That's the point where even the tardigrade cannot continue, right?
There is eventually, ladies and gentlemen, spoiler alert, there may well be a heat death of the universe. So, yeah, that is the... something that Brian Cox still smiles when he says it. I don't know what he knows. But even then, when we were doing our arena tour, he'd always go, and then eventually there'll be no life in the universe.
I like the...
Except me. All beautiful.
Spider building a web, and I thought that was like the defining quality of spiders. But no, there are some spiders that are called ambush hunters, which basically wait on a particular surface for a bee or another insect to come along and then basically grab it, which is sort of horrifying. And there are some particular kinds of spiders that actually utilise UV light. Apparently bees, when they're looking for flowers, they try and find a brightly coloured flower. There's UV marker on flowers that say, oh, this is a particularly great flower, you should come over here, bee. The spiders mimic that UV reflectivity to attract the bee. The bee comes over expecting to find a particularly great flower. The spider grabs it. It's pretty horrifying, yeah.
Mood lighting.
Yeah.
I'd like to see a spider version of Changing Rooms with a kind of spidery Lauren. What's his name? Lawrence Llewellyn Bowen. That's the one.
So what do you know that ultraviolet thing of bees? Do you know more about that? That is fascinating because we've already got the waggle dance, which is one of the most beautiful.
Yeah, but I think a lot of animals. I think spiders use that because I was looking at some other stuff with spiders, and some spiders, when they are molting their skins, they're shedding their skins. They're evolving. They're getting their new sort of hard sort of exoskeleton type thing. So they build a web that normally their webs are invisible because they're trying to trap things in them. But when they are shedding, when they're molting, they build a web that can be seen by the creatures because it reflects UV light really brightly. So the birds don't just fly into it and kill the spider when it's really vulnerable. So they seem to use UV light in kind of a nice way to say, hey, let me get on with molting in my web, but also in a kind of evil, hey, bee, this is something you really like.
Just to go off on a little tangent, it's just a matter of time, probably decades, before we can all see in UV.
Oh, really?
You heard about this? Infrared UV, the kind of things where normally you'd have to have kind of goggles over your real eyes.
Is this all because of women's contraceptives again?
No.
They only get blamed for everything.
So I was having this really fascinating conversation with an ophthalmic surgeon who does an amazing fix for people that have macular degeneration, where you lose the sort of central part of the fovea, and he puts in a lens. So he smashes up their real lens, which is usually covered in cataracts by that age.
Right. This is
Takes
under
it out of
anaesthetic.
the eye, then puts a contact lens not over the eye, but into where your natural biological lens goes.
Oh, wow.
And he was saying, well, this is still clumsy. And actually, incidentally, the fix was based on how they fixed the Hubble telescope. You know, the images came back blurry.
Yeah.
The physics, because he's such a physics geek, this guy, he loved the maths and the physics of how they did that, because obviously you can't go back up there to the telescope, change it, you have to do it all down here. Similar kind of problem with the eye in macular degeneration. Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing on the digression.
Yeah,
Apologies.
I heard about that. The whole darkest part of the universe, darkest part of the eye, and there's this sort of weird overlaps, aren't there, apparently, in the science, yeah.
And so all that, if you're wondering, that the cure there, it just broadcasts the image over a greater patch of the retina, which means the parts of the retina that would normally cover peripheral vision are actually now seeing stuff that's in the fovea. Wow. So it means you get your central vision back, the brain can work it out. But sorry, what he was talking about was how they're going to start replacing the retina. So forget messing around at the front of the eye with the lens. They're going to replace the retina with photosensitive, cyborg kind of cells. Well, because you'd be a cyborg once you got it in you.
Yeah.
And then they would plug into the neurons. Now he's saying once you've got that right, and they're really pushing this hard, it's multi-million, so it's a huge... In fact, he also quipped, we were getting changed after I'd interviewed him doing... Can you believe this guy was talking to me whilst he was doing the surgery? So when we were getting changed, this tiny little thing, he's like, oh yeah, my family've got a pharmaceutical company. I've just sold my stake and I'm ploughing all of the money into research in MIT and Harvard in order to make these things a reality sooner. Sorry, but once you get these things, you could have it where you're not just helping people who have a problem with their eyesight, you can have perfectly good eyesight, yet you get your retina changed so that you can see all sorts of parts of the electromagnetic spectrum beyond the visible scale. How awesome
So you
is
can
that?
get lured into massive spider webs. Brilliant.
Don't
Spider
do
can
it.
grab you when you see a really nice flower.
Can't
Has
wait.
anyone here seen...
That
Sorry.
changes so much, though, wouldn't it? I mean, just the way we wouldn't be... I mean, yeah, that's a really quick, in terms of evolution, that would be a huge change to human beings, wouldn't it? Practically overnight.
Has anyone here seen the Ray Milland film X, the Man with X-Ray Eyes? I'll
Just
just
you.
warn you. I'll
Just
just
you.
warn you. Ray Milland starts mucking around with eyes and eventually makes X-ray eyes, and at the end of he manages to see the very centre of the universe and is driven mad and plucks out his own eyes in a religious revivalist tent. Now, if that's not a warning of your scientists playing gods
Beware.
by being
It's
imaginary.
all got a bit King Lear.
I quite like the idea of creatures and animals that kind of spruce up their environments anyway. And obviously, this particular story about the spider, it has a very, it was very useful because it lures in its prey. But there was a really interesting story that came out a couple of years ago about bees that actually decorate inside their kind of nest areas, and they wallpaper it with flowers, with flower petals, and no one else gets to ever see it except for them. So no one could figure out what's the purpose of it, other than that they quite liked it to look pretty, which means perhaps they have an appreciation for art and beauty.
Aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's kind of a
Bee
busman's holiday, though, for a bee, isn't it? Because you're like going around the flowers all day, and then you come home, got away from the flowers. Oh no, they're there again.
It's like people who play driving games when they get to motorway service stations, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it is... that is a fact, because that's yesterday when Dan Davis was here talking about immunology, and he started off by talking about the famous piece of Richard Feynman talking about the fact is, I got a friend who's an artist, and sometimes he says something I don't agree with too well. He says, when I see a flower, I see the beauty of the flower, but you as a scientist, you pick it apart and it becomes a dull thing. And he talks about the fact that it doesn't make it a dull thing, and one of the things Richard Feynman mentions is the colour of the flowers. He said, the colour of the flowers that seem to be more attractive to certain insects. Does this mean that insects have within them some kind of aesthetic sense? And that merely because we believe that all of the kind of aesthetic things, many of the ones we go to, are extraneous, that's no reason to actually say that it doesn't stem from the same things.
And Robin, there was another interesting story as well. We were talking about earlier to do with spiders that you spotted in the news this week, and this was to do with them counting.
Yeah, this is a spider called, I think, Portia africana, and it's this is research that was done in New Zealand by a psychologist and also by a zoologist. And what they found is it appears that spiders know the difference between one, two, and many. And that is basically when your children are very small, they it takes a while until they become aware of one, two, and many, and the spiders have this one in particular. It's very hard to explain because these experiments. One of the things that I find very beautiful about these kind of is they are such wonderful kind of Heath Robinson machines and paths that are made. So what was created was a path between. So the Portia africana spider can see a number of other spiders. It has quite a good visual sense because it preys on other spiders, so it has to have an ability to ensure that it doesn't become the prey. And so it can see these it has this ability to kind of has a rich visual sense. And what would happen is they'd made this little pathway so that you could see various different alternative numbers of spiders. The Portia africana would come out. It would see, for instance, maybe where the one spider was. I think it was actually 3 spiders or 6 spiders, and ones and twos. Sorry. Then it would go on the path, and then they would design the path so for a while the spider could no longer see its prey. But then when it came round the corner, it had actually been taken the wrong direction, and it would have the wrong number. It would not have the ones that the spider believed should correlate with what it had seen before.
It sounds like a
which
horrifying...
is just, it's a beautiful kind of pragmatic version of, Pac-Man in its own way. And I think it's, so they've using this system of the surprise, the fact that the expected is not the result. Using that, they've basically gone various different pathways that they now believe that between 1, 2, and many, the Portia africana is one of...
Tell it's surprised though. How do they?
Have you ever seen?
That's a surprised spider.
Have you ever seen a startled spider?
No,
Because when those great big hairy eyebrows go up, but it's I think it's the fact that it will move like this. It will go. There we go. I'm off going there. Oh, I've just gone round the corner.
Stamps its foot.
Hang on a minute. Yeah.
Sort of stamping 8 legs is quite frustration. Yeah,
Cuttlefish are better than spiders then, because cuttlefish can count up to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that if you give them a choice between 4 shrimp or 5 shrimp, they can, at a snapshot, they'll always go for the 5 over the 4. And they, so there you go. Cuttlefish are more numerate than spiders.
I feel like we're playing counting animal top trumps now. Yeah. Which my animal can count more than your animal.
Ability to count, 4.
Wow. Speaking of games, would you lot like to play a very little game with us? Yeah, come on, enthusiasm. We all love audience participation, don't we? Right, what we thought we'd do, it's nice and simple, and we'll get each of our lovely panellists up here to say a word, a term, and what it means. Now, one of them is a true scientific term, and with its true scientific definition. The other 2 are bogus. So they are real words, but they don't mean anything to do with science whatsoever. So we're going to invite each of our panellists to say their word and the definition, and you have to see who is telling the truth. Okay.
So I'll read mine out first. It's anfractus, and I'll give you the definition, and we'll all take turns, and then at the end, you're all going to really cheer for the one that you like the most, but not now. Anfractus is, with tectonic plates, when they meet, sometimes there can be a destructive boundary where one goes under the other and the rock dissolves in the magma, hot magma under the Earth's crust. And some can be constructive, where they kind of rise up into, islands like Hawaii, whatever. So anfractus is a tectonic plate that's so far away from a boundary that it never gets broken. There's no chance of that landmass ever being kind of destroyed by geological forces in millennia. It's been intact for millennia. It will remain intact for many millennia more, i.e. a very safe place to build a house. Anfractus.
Robin.
I love Call My Bluff, and I never got the chance to do it. So. Boborygmus, Frank. Boborygmus. Boborygmus or Boborygmus is something that any of you who've recently visited a dentist will know about, which is, how often when the dentist is leaning over you and just meddling with your teeth, their stomach gurgles perpetually. There is something about the stomach of dentists. It's also something, anyone who's ever done a breakfast radio show will know there is a point that as they're trying to read the newspapers, instead the deafening sound of basically intestinal gurgling and gas. And that's what boborygmus is. It is particularly for newspaper reviewers and dentists, it is the sound of the bubbling of intestinal gas.
Thank you, Robin. Helen, over to you.
Very evocative. Yes, mine is calopigian, I've got to say it right, which is a way of measuring the amount of heat that is generated on the surface of the moon by the sun.
There you go. Okay, so have a think. Is it anfractus, boborygmus, and or callipygian? I will say each word. Pick only one, please, and cheer very, very loudly if you believe that that is the correct scientific term. So we will start first with Dr. Jack's anfractus. Make some noise for anfractus. Okay, relatively popular. How about Robin with his boborygmus? Ooh,
I didn't find it at all plausible.
And how about Helen with her callipygian? Okay, I think it's between anfractus and boborygmus. I'm going to ask you to now just split your votes, and we'll do that one more time. Okay, so for anfractus, make some noise. For boborygmus, go wild. I think they nailed it.
Wisdom of the crowd does it again.
You're a smart lot here at Latitude. Robin was telling the truth. Who knew?
Well done,
boborygmus. Tummy gurgling in the intestines.
So if you want to know the real definitions of the others, anfractus means a winding or circuitous path. Callipygian is shapely buttocks.
Right, back to the science then. Jack, this is your second story that you selected to us this week. It's all to do with a vaccine which may have been developed against heroin use.
That's right. So there is something of an opioid epidemic going on around the world. It's particularly bad in the States. And so there's real interest in creating a vaccine, an anti-heroin vaccine. Now, heroin is a bizarre story. I recently went to visit a friend of mine who lives in Thailand, and I went up to the Golden Triangle, which is the borders of Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos. And for many, many years, it was a hotbed of opium production. And it was in the museum in the Golden Triangle that I learned that the reason that heroin was invented by a pharmaceutical company in the first place was because lots of people were getting addicted to opium. And when they launched it, they were like, yeah, it's just like opium, but not addictive. Wrong. wrong. So there are a lot of smack addicts around in Bloomsbury, where I did my PhD, and they, you see them kind of wandering around a lot, and these people are completely, their entire life, it revolves around getting more smack, getting more heroin. And to see these people walking around, it's quite amazing the degree to which their drive of everything to do with their life is just funneled in to get more smack. And you can kind of see it in their behavior as they wander around. For many years, I observed them from a distance. So this piece of science, I think, is going to be really, really important for humanity in the sense that there's lots of people addicted to heroin. They've now created a vaccine which worked in rats several years ago. The big news is they've got it working in non-human primates. So they tested this vaccine. This was work done at the Scripps Research Institute, which is in La Jolla in California, hence the reference to the American Indians in that location, right at the top of the show. They've now got it working. So they had 4 rhesus monkeys. They tested this anti-heroin vaccine on them. And in the first month, they got a really strong response, which means that just as with any vaccine, your immune system knows what to look out for. It knows, in this case, what the heroin molecule looks like. It attaches to it, signals it to the rest of the immune system, and doesn't let it across the blood-brain barrier into the brain. So in rhesus monkeys, at least, they don't get high. There's no negative side effects. And this is an important part of preclinical testing before you can start testing it in humans. You need to prove that it works in small mammals, non-human primates, then it should work in humans. So 2 of these 4 rhesus monkeys happen to have been involved in an earlier pilot study, and so they'd been pre-exposed to this anti-heroin vaccine, and it worked particularly well in them. So as with any vaccine, the hope is that in this case it lasted 8 months, a good kind of prevention of the effects of heroin. So even if someone on cold turkey did shoot up, the heroin in their blood wouldn't have any impact on their brain, so they wouldn't get the high they're looking for, right? So the great thing is that because if you've been pre-exposed to it, you can get a booster injection on your vaccine a little bit later. It means that there's a chance that these people could end up being, immune to the effects of heroin for years and years. But obviously then there's a problem, because what if they have to go to hospital and they need opiate medication, which is still like the gold standard of pain relief, to deal with healing from some illness? You don't want to make these people like permanently insensitive to opiates. So that's why this is exciting, because it specifically targets the heroin molecule and the heroin derivatives that are kind of produced when you take it into your body. It doesn't affect other opioids. So it could be quite miraculous for people dealing with horrible, intractable, physical simple addictions like heroin addiction.
How long do we think that this may be until we can actually start seeing it trialled in humans?
Pretty soon. Pretty soon. Yeah. Once you've got good data, I mean, maybe it depends on what people think of. Well, that's only 4 primates. Maybe you should do it on a larger sample before you go putting it into humans. But usually, they weigh up the sort of severity of the need. If you remember, with lots of sort of virus outbreaks, they do crazy things that wouldn't, they create drugs in such a rush that you'd never normally get it out if you weren't trying to deal with the Ebola outbreak, for example, So it is possible to get drugs to market really, really quickly if there's a real pressing need to do so. And the opioid addiction, the epidemic in the States, is really worrying and a massive problem. To the point that, VR, there's all these sort of dystopian futures where everyone gets so addicted to virtual reality that they'll stop going outside. Because if you can create any world you can imagine, then it's likely to be better than the real world eventually. But this New Scientist event on Thursday, it was very good down at the Barbican. They were actually touting virtual reality as a possible way to help people get over all sorts of sort of problems that we have in society, including helping people with their drug addictions. So instead of doing that, you could do a bit of both, right? As my mum pointed out earlier when we were chatting about it, if you give people an anti-heroin vaccine, you're not dealing with the underlying cause of the problem that makes them seek the heroin in the first place. So the anti-heroin vaccine alone is just the first step. It's a very helpful tool, but you need to do lots of other stuff to actually help people deal with the true cause, the root cause of the problem.
So I'm going to play a little bit devil's advocate here, because obviously there's huge merits to this research, as anyone can see, but there's something slightly Clockwork Orange about it, as in, could this eventually, in years and years and years to come, be abused by people in power? Could it be used as a way to remove people's agency of choice? Like, do you not stop at heroin? Do you eventually say, right, we're going to vaccinate the human beings against the highs of alcohol?
Birth, you don't respond to alcohol. Imagine.
But it could be abused, couldn't it? Down the line? Am I the only person? Is everyone just looking at me like, no, this is just a good thing, that could never happen?
Isn't it that all of these things can be abused? That's part of the again, it returns to that old quote, the old Buddhist monk quote. The keys to heaven also open the gates to hell. That all of the ingenuity, for all of the curiosity, that there are always ways. Tragically, many of the most incredible medical innovations initially come from the horrors of war. We're always finding, and that's the problem of the seeming complexity of being human. So thank heavens we live in a simulation.
It's interesting you should say that. It's really interesting you should say it, because if it wasn't for World War II bringing together the best brains in science, across the whole of Europe, the Allied forces grouping together, that in order to sort of defend against the Nazis, in order to create more effective weapons, those scientists got together and stumbled upon things like, not just sonar and radar, but magnetic resonance, like nuclear physics, which could end up being therapies now. And we'd have had, basically, as someone who did his PhD scanning brains in an MRI machine, there would have been no MRI. We'd have had to wait many, many more decades if it wasn't for bringing those brains together during the war effort for the sake of defense and attack, but then later those same technologies can be adapted to other purposes. So you're absolutely right. We might still not be able to scan, might not be able to look inside people's brains without chopping their skull open, even now, if it wasn't for the war. It's bizarre, isn't it?
But even I was just thinking, coming back to the heroin thing, isn't it? I must admit, I really, really don't know very much at all about drugs. So I know heroin is presumably different to that marijuana, but that's probably about as much as I know. But it has a different effect, I gather. People take it for different reasons. But isn't it that if you have an addictive personality, like there are things I would really like to stop doing. I'm quite addicted, nothing weird. Chocolate milk or something.
Now's the time. Now's the time to let it out.
That it's kind of a tendency to have an addictive personality. So I suppose wouldn't maybe the next step be to try and alter that, to try and alter people's tendency to get hooked on particular things? Because there isn't anything. I mean, presumably heroin is very nice. Hence, people keep. Some of you may know. I don't know.
I hear it's quite Moorish.
Yes, but you're just going to move on to something else, aren't you? You're going to go if you're having a really low patch, if you're having a really difficult patch, and you can't take heroin anymore, you're just going to try something else.
But this is the thing.
I'm looking at you, Robin. But no.
But this is the thing, and if you can vaccinate against heroin, even perhaps from young children before they even develop a taste for it, so to speak, couldn't you eventually one day just vaccinate all children? Routine. You get your MMI, you get your pox vaccine, all the rest of it, and you get all recreational drugs vaccinated as well. And in fact, I'd be quite interested to know. I mean, how many people here have kids? Put your hand up if you're a parent. Okay. And now keep your hands up. Keep your hands up, parents. All right. Keep your hands up if you could vaccinate your children against all recreational drugs.
Yeah.
think we have
That's
only
a Latitude
open-minded
answer.
liberal parents.
Just for the benefit of those listening at home, it was almost unanimous. Almost all parents said that they wouldn't vaccinate their children against recreational drugs, which is interesting.
Apart from my parents.
Apart from Jack's parents, it's too late. No, I'm joking. So it's interesting because that whole, the idea that we as human beings have a choice if we want to make either mistakes or do things which have high risk behaviours is part of a really important part of the human condition, I think. Yeah. Okay.
I'm in front of my parents, I can't comment.
and that was based on a primate study, wasn't it? So
so that was rhesus monkeys.
Rhesus monkeys.
Yeah.
Helen, another really interesting primate story this week. This is to do with much nicer behaviour than drug taking. Altruism and chimps. Tell us about
it's
it.
a lovely story, actually. I really enjoyed reading about this. Yes, there's 2 studies, actually. The first one is in captive chimps, and it's all kind of got quite a lot of complex control mechanisms, etc. But essentially, they showed that pretty much most of the time, if a chimp has a choice between getting, say, 4 banana pellets for itself or giving itself 3 banana pellets and its fellow chimps that it's just met each 3 banana pellets, even though it can count, presumably, so it knows that it's getting 1 less, but it still chooses to do that rather than take all the banana pellets, extra banana pellets for itself. And they sort of added an extra layer to this. They basically put a chimp in the exercise who was always trained to pick the same option. So he always trained to pick the option that gave the other chimp the option to decide how many banana pellets it got, rather than just taking all the food for itself. And so there was a sort of element of reciprocity. There was an element of sort of, oh, you've been nice. It's sort of politeness, like, after somebody's had you round to their house for dinner, so you have them round, kind of thing. So
it was slightly fixed. So one of the chimps was trained to show this altruistic behaviour just by habit.
Yes.
And then that sort of started the exchange in a
yes,
positive
just
way.
to see if it was,
Will the other one be altruistic back and say, I will forgo an extra chip so that you can gain more too, my fellow chimpy
So
friend.
yeah, just to see if the experience of altruism influenced the other chimps to show altruism in return. So not just just trying to prove that it wasn't just some kind of reflexive behaviour, or it wasn't just, that there was some sort of meaning to it. There was some sort of response to the situation that the chimp was finding itself in. Oh, that chimp's done a nice thing for me, I'm going to do a nice thing back, which is really nice. And the other study was in a group of wild chimps, where they noticed that chimps do this thing called border patrol, where they sort of go around the edge of their territory, and sometimes they will meet other groups of chimps that all turn violent. They get into big nasty fights. It's horrible. And they tried to work out why the chimps, there appears to be no penalty. If you're a male chimp and you don't volunteer to do this, there doesn't appear to be any penalty to that, but some chimps would volunteer anyway, even if they didn't have close relatives within the group. So even if they weren't actually defending their own family or their own relatives, they still volunteered to do this, even though it was a risk to themselves, even though they might be injured, they might be killed by other chimps. So
what do they gain from it? I mean, why do something if you're not going to gain? Because that's how we think of decision making.
But that's the thing, they seem to just be generally, they either because it increased their chances of mating in future, so they were keeping the group safe, they were keeping the group's territory safe. That meant that they had more of a chance of forming a pair bond.
So it could boost their social status.
Yeah, exactly. So there was that, but it wasn't really clear. It just seemed to be a thing that they did because it was a good thing to do, which is.
But it seems bizarre, doesn't it? Because they stand to lose life and limb.
And there's no apparent penalty to not doing it. Yeah.
Oh, really? So it's not like they get in trouble with the alpha if they didn't do their patrol?
As far as the researchers could tell, there didn't seem to be an obvious, you weren't shunned if you didn't take.
Clip round the
you weren't like
staying in the nest instead of going
exactly.
out.
So it sort of generally, and there's another side study that they mention as well about rats. If a rat sees another rat that is drowning or having quite an unpleasant experience, getting very, very wet, and it also says that's behind one door and another door has chocolate behind it, the rat will let the drowning rat out first before going to get the chocolate. So,
altruistic rats.
So there's a lot of altruism around in the animal
Isn't
kingdom.
that the definition of altruism? Because what you were saying there, Jack, about them not getting anything back, is that it has to be by definition something that you're not necessarily going to benefit from yourself.
Yeah, no guarantee of you do good for the sake of doing good, right?
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be the case. Yeah, that there isn't, and particularly rats that had experienced themselves being in this very wet sort of room, getting kind of water poured down on them. They were particularly quick to let the other rat out. So again, it was like an example of I know what that's like. It's not very nice. I'm not going to eat the chocolate.
Waterboarding's nasty.
Yeah.
I feel for you.
Yeah. I think it's
exactly.
I think it's particularly impressive what you were saying about the chimps actually giving up. Was it banana pellets?
Yes.
Because that's something, feeding habits. It's so key to their survival. I mean, I don't know how many of us would give up, our meal to allow someone else have a meal if it came down to survival.
I did buy
of the-
snacks for the car. Can I point that out?
You're
actually?
very altruistic, Helen.
Not only that, you did give me a banana immediately before this show,
He was testing
just
it
to
out with it.
heighten
That's
your
true,
own
that's true.
standing.
And
Because we've known each other 10
Yeah,
years,
if-
and one thing I always think about is you're rarely generous with your bananas.
never
but
offered you
now,
a banana in my life.
all of a sudden, what largesse?
That's the influence of the chimps.
Yeah.
My life has been bettered by those good apes. Yes.
When I was reading about this study, though, they kept on saying, chimps, just like humans, are altruistic. And I mean, you've obviously proved how altruistic you are with your sharing of bananas with Robin.
Yeah.
But I wonder how
I
many.
didn't give him a whole banana. I
You
didn't.
did give- you were
No, I
very
was like
generous.
feeding him pellets. That
It's
would
a
be
little bit
that'd be
bruised.
weird. It was. It'd been in my bag.
To be fair, Helen, you did try and push that banana on many people before Robin finally accepted it.
Will someone see my
I
kindness?
can't eat all of them. Yeah.
But it's the ultimate human test, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how many people out here watch Love Island, for example, but they're going to have to decide, aren't they? Do they keep the 50 grand themselves or split it in their couple? And there was that game show, wasn't there? Was it Golden Balls that Jasper Carrot used to do? And you had to decide at the end. And honestly, more often than not, they'd screw each other over to get the extra cash. So I don't know how altruistic we are when it
maybe
comes
not.
down to the crunch.
Interestingly, there's a fascinating series of studies published in the last few months in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, PNAS, really good journal. And it showed that even people who are quite greedy, as in a kind of economic exchange, they have an opportunity to kind of screw the other person over by taking more than the fair share. If you make people make those decisions quickly, don't give them time to think. If they're acting just on instinct, humans are very altruistic. It's just when you're given time to mull it over and give yourself excuses for being a selfish prat. You know what I mean? But it's also with greed. Interesting, proclivity to greed is affected so much by things like how much of an education you have in economics. People who are formally educated in economics are selfish and greedy because they've kind of intellectualized that that's right. That's good for the economy. We want everyone to be greedy, but that's not our default setting. And I found that quite reassuring in a world of rapacious kind of greed. Everyone, no matter how much people have, they want more, and that's not always kind of gets them what they want in life in the long run. If you think of people that work like crazy to get to early retirement and then drop dead of a heart attack on day one, it's sort of altruism is our nature, which is a wonderful thing.
Well, isn't that when John Nash was doing the game theory work in the late 50s and early 60s, that what the hope was, because it was to look at the nuclear build-up, isn't that right? It was the nuclear build-up and to kind of understand human beings and hopefully their venality and their meanness, and then the discovery was they weren't getting the results that they hoped for. And I mean, there was even in the 80s. I remember Richard Dawkins presenting a Horizon called "Good Guys Finish First," which again was looking at the fact that, as you said, really the instinct is generosity, and that's why so much of the kind of politics and so much of the campaigning we saw in April was trying to say someone else is trying to take stuff from you. And strangely enough, 40% of people kind of started to question that, and you have more and more people going, well, do you know what, I will pay more tax to live in a civilization. And I think once people start to go, oh, hang on, they would do that as well. It's okay. Not everyone is after you all the time.
It's such a fascinating topic because one branch of neuroeconomics looks at how decisions are made when, if you think of like neighboring countries, will they go to war with each other? And they showed that, sometimes the reason people default on a deal with their neighbours, say one nation or another, try and act greedily, try and sort of do a land grab or something, it's through fear because they're worried that the other nation might pounce first, and once you've made the move, then you have the upper hands kind of thing. And when you sort of run mathematical models across like many, many neighbouring groups, so instead of just 2 people, but like 100 interacting groups all neighbouring, you can see how so long as there are clusters of altruism going on where people behave fairly with it, and they don't have too many links with other agents who are greedy and will screw you over, the altruism can it can survive in pockets. But wherever there's too many greedy neighbours, it just sort of spreads virulently. And so this whole, you're talking about game theory, when you've got 2 massive nuclear threats, if anyone hits the button, then it's curtains, and you're kind of a little bit like, do we really want to hit the button? Yeah. That's kind of shifted the rules a little bit in terms of what the models show, because when the risk is that high, if you go for it, then people become, but the usual rules of engagement break down. So it's strangely, I can't remember when you said Nash didn't find what he was looking for. What can you remember the details of? what he was expecting to find?
I can't remember now the exact, because the research was, the hope was, the belief in Washington was that we would find out that people were they were just interested in self, and that everyone will always sell out. The normal scenario is things like sell out the other person if you've done a crime together, or if it's involving sharing out the money, you will go often with actually a system which doesn't necessarily give you more, but definitely gives you something, and the other person will get nothing. And I think the surprise was when they did that with various different... I think initially they started off maybe with people who were kind of in the typing pool, and they were going, this isn't working out how we thought. And as far as I remember, I might be wrong about absolutely everything I've said. 48 years old and my memory's not what it was, but it's that you are, the expectation, they then started to try and skew the results because it wasn't getting what the military-industrial complex were hoping for.
Do you know what I'm just enjoying, Robin? The fact that in one breath there you were quite optimistic about the beauty of human beings and our nature, but on the other hand you would also quite like to eat some.
Yeah. I only want to eat them because they seem so good. And if I eat more of the people who are good, then maybe I'll get better.
The only time I think about cannibalism is watching the Olympics. I shouldn't have owned up to that, but
What?
Big muscles. Big muscles. It looks juicy, delicious. Oh, come on, I'm just getting in on the cannibalism gag. Sorry.
All right, this
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to
Moving on to
Cannibal
chocolate.
Group Therapy.
Yes.
All this talk of bananas earlier has got my Bobarigmus going, Helen.
Oh.
And I'd like to end really on talking about chocolate, because Robin, this is a story you found this week, cocoa and chocolate, and it's a nice one to end on, I reckon.
It's a nice one to end on, but I have to admit I'm sceptical
Ooh.
on this. This is Italian research that's recently done, which is the moment you ever see research goes, red wine is good for you. A new piece of research funded by Paul Masson. There's always... Funded by Cadbury's. I don't know who's funded this research, and it may well actually be perfectly decent research, but I could only find out it's basically that cocoa, in particular dark chocolate, is good for increasing, for instance, working memory. And also, I think, as well as working memory, I made a note of something else, which is improves also the way that we analyse visual information that we take in. So it seems to be dark chocolate that if you just have an enormous amount of it, huge. No, I don't know how much it is, but as much as you want. And apparently, it also has benefits on cardiovascular health as well.
So what is it in the chocolate that's so good for us?
Magic.